Hi, I'm GoTiger, and welcome to part 3 of my tutorial series where we create a custom user interface and import it into the game, and create the scripting associated with it so that we can react to events within the game and update our user interface. In the first part, we created our UI with our separate images. In the second part, we did some scripting and we imported those images into a pack file and we're able to display the first tier of the custom UI on our campaign screen. In today's video, we will go through adding some additional constants and declarations and some code to limit our script to function for a specific faction and to ensure that it's only a human player. And we will add some functions in preparation for adding our resource and the new battle completed event handler, which will increment our resource based on the results of the battle. So let's start off by looking at the new constants we're going to add this episode. So if we go to our constants section of our script, which is here. Here. So at the moment we've only got constants for the position, but we want to add 2 new groups of constants. 3 new groups. So the first one we want to add is a constant for the faction that our script should be running under. So this will be called tutorial faction. Now this has to match the key of the faction inside the game database, the engine. So we want to limit this script from this point forward to only function for Balthasar Gelt's faction. So to do that, we set our tutorial faction as equal to WH2 because he came in under Warhammer 2. He came in DLC 13. He is part of the Empire, so we add EMP. And then we add in his faction name, which is the Golden Order, like so. So that's the faction name: WH2 DLC 13 EMP Golden Order. That's Balthasar Gelt's faction, and we will use this in a little while. The next thing we want to add is a few more constants. So the first block is all about defining the amount of resource we will earn when we achieve a victory on the battlefield. So that I'm aware of, there are 2 different ways of doing resources in Warhammer 2 modding. You can do it all in the database in the back end using pooled resource and resource tables. And if you want to tie into characters and building chains and the scrap system and tie into things like raiding and battles automatically, then you use these pooled resources. Another way of doing it, which I call scripted resources, is handling everything inside your script and not having to create anything at all inside the database. So they're polar opposites, if you will. One is all in the database, the other is all in the script. So today we're going to be going through part of creating the version that's all in the script. So for that we're going to need several constants and a couple of declarations, a couple of variables. So this first block of constants is defining the types of victories that we're going to be looking for and the amounts earned when those victories are achieved. So we want a new constant called tutorial victory type, and the first one is a Pyrrhic _victory, and then we want another one. Let's just copy and paste to be quicker. So we'll copy and tutorial victory type. I just realized I should have named that something. That should be tutorial Pyrrhic victory type. And then this one is tutorial close victory type. So then this part changes to close. Then the third type we're monitoring for is decisive. I've forgotten how to spell. Decisive victory type. Yeah, that's right. The decisive victory type, and we just set this like so. Sorry about that mental block there for a moment. And then the final one that we're monitoring for is heroic victory type. So GROI, heroic. Yeah. Okay. So those are the constants for the strings we're going to be looking for to be returned by the campaign manager. Now we need to define how much resource we will give if the player achieves one of those victory types. So for tutorial, and then we call it resource Pyrrhic. Pyrrhic victory. Tutorial resource, actually, let's make that battle, because it's how much resource we're getting from a battle. Tutorial resource battle Pyrrhic victory, we will give 20 points of resource for achieving that victory type. So let's do our next one. So next one is a close victory, and we'll make that 25 points. Next one is the decisive. I remembered how to spell it that time. We'll make that one, let's jump up to 35 points for that one. And the final one is for the heroic victory type, and we'll make that 50. So we have our constants for checking what type of victory, and our constants for assigning how much resource they will gain from that. Our last block of constants is the constants that define how much resource is needed to move between the different tiers that we have on our custom user interface. So we will create them as such. So it will be tutorial, resource, and then we have our tier. So tier 1 target. So how much do we need to hit tier 1? And we're just going to set that as 20. So that when we fight our first battle in our testing, that we, regardless of what type of victory we achieve, we will get enough resource to move to that first tier. So let's just copy that, because it's much easier to copy paste here now. So tutorial resource tier 2, we're going to add 30 more points. Add 30 more points. So that's going to be 50 needs to be accumulated to reach tier 2. Then to reach tier 3, we're going to add another 30 points. That's 80 now. So incrementing by 30 for each tier. So tier 4, we're going to be at 110. Then for tier 5, we will be at 140. And for tier 6, we will set that to 170. Yeah, tier 7, it's 200. And to reach tier 8, we'll set that to 230. And to reach tier 9, we'll set that to 260. So these are just arbitrary figures. They're just small enough that we can move through our different tiers pretty quickly as we're doing our testing. If you were creating a full-blown mechanic from this, you'd probably want to have much larger gaps between your tiers, and you'll probably want to have those gaps between tiers increasing as the campaign went on. So if you look at my renown system for Belagar in the Hammer of Grogny, it starts off small with the first with the target to reach tier 1 being 50, and then the target to reach tier 2 being 50, and then jumps up to 75, then 100, then 125, and then 150, and so on. But for now, we just want to keep it relatively small so that we can perform our testing quite easily. So there's our groups of constants that we need. So alongside those constants, we're going to want to declare a few more variables. So the first one is about tracking if it's the AI or the player that's controlling the faction that our script is running for. So we want a new variable, and we call that local faction, and then is player controlled. And then we set that to false as a default. And then another declaration that we want is we want to track the total resource that we've accumulated through all the battles we've won. So we want local m, and we're going to call that tutorial. Let's call it tutorial resource amount. And that defaults to 0. Okay, so those are the new declarations or variables we need, along with the new constants. So what do we want to do now? Well, we want to go to our constructor. So if you remember from last time, we have our line where we get the faction name. Now we're actually going to use that faction name now in this constructor. So with that, we want to determine, is the local faction that's being used, is it Balthazar Gelt's faction? So new line, so if local faction is equal to, and then tutorial faction. Okay, so if it is, we want to get a reference to the faction object. So go local faction is equal to, and we get that reference from the campaign manager. So we use the shorthand CM, and then we create a call to get faction, and we pass it the name of the faction we're looking for. And we can either pass it local faction name or tutorial faction. It doesn't really matter, because for them to have reached this point in the code, they must be the same. So let's just pass it the local faction name. So that will give us back a reference to a real faction object, which has a whole number of methods and things that we can interact with. And we are going to be calling a method or a check called if faction, we're checking is human. So this will tell us, is it a real person controlling the faction, or is it the AI? So if the faction is human, then we set our new Boolean flag, is player controlled. We set that to true. So we've come in, we've gotten our faction name. We then check that faction name. Is it Balthazar Gelt's faction? Yes, it is. So we come in, we say, okay, I would like a reference to the real faction object for this faction. The campaign manager will give that to us, and we can then check off of that reference, is the player human? If they are, then we update our flag so that we know now from this point forward that we can always use this flag to check whether or not the player is both human and is playing as Balthazar Gelt. So we will use this flag pretty much straight away. So if local faction is player controlled, then, and we encapsulate our two initialization function calls. So we put that there. So now when the script kicks off, it will create the faction, get the faction reference, update the flag, and then we will check, is it the AI playing as Balthazar Gelt? If it is, we do not want to create the UI elements, because you don't see UI elements for the AI when they're taking their turns. And we don't want the AI interacting with this in any way at the moment. So we don't even want to set off the event listeners. We only want to create those UI elements and event listeners if it's a human player controlling Balthazar Gelt. So if it's a human player controlling a dwarf faction, or even Karl Franz's faction, because that they do not match the key of Balthazar Gelt's faction, It will come in and this will be false, and they would leave. And once it's left, that will be the end of the script execution. It wouldn't do anything else. So all of our other stuff would just be sitting there untouched, which is exactly what we want. So we've got a new check. So what do we want to do next? So we've got our resource, we've got our targets. Well, we're going to do a couple of functions that will be used in one of our event handlers that we're going to create. But we'll create the functions first. So the first function we want to create is called, well, let's move down to where our functions are first. Let's put it here, just above the UI elements. So we're going to create a function called get resource earned by victory type, and we're going to pass in victory type like so. So we want to create a new variable inside there, so we'll call that amount. Don't forget the n. So amount, and that defaults to 0. And we're then going to also return that amount. Okay, there we go. So come in, amount 0. Wow, what do we do now? Well, this is where we start to use our constants that we created earlier. So we're going to do a couple of we're going to do an if-else block where we're going to be checking a couple of things. So we're going to go if the victory type, which we've been passed as a parameter, is equal to, and then we're going to look at our first constant. And the first constant we're looking at is, where is it? There it is, that one. Tutorial Pyrrhic victory type. So if the victory type were passed, if this victory type were passed, when we actually call this function, which we'll do later, the victory type were passed, if it matches this type that we defined in the constant earlier, then what do we want to do? Well, we want to set the amount of resource earned is equal to the other constant that we defined for the Pyrrhic victory type as well. So if you remember, we also did the resource battle Pyrrhic victory. So it will come in, is the victory type, does it match our victory type, which we defined earlier? If it does, then we update the amount to this value, and this value happens to be, I think, 20, I think it was. So that will handle a Pyrrhic victory. But we also want to do the same for other types of victories. So let's just copy this line, and we then go else, and then just paste the rest, paste that line we copied. So we'll end up as an else if, because most of it's the same. So else if victory type is equal to tutorial, but instead of Pyrrhic, we change this to close. We then copy this line and paste it in, and everything's the same except instead of Pyrrhic, we change that to close. So we've now got 2 of our 4 handled. So let's just copy both lines, move down a few, paste it in, and we now check, is the victory type not close, but we want decisive. And we change this to match to decisive as well. D-E-C-I-S, D-E-C-I-S. Thought I'd missed a letter there. I-V-E. Okay. And then our final one is else if for is the victory type heroic. Like so. And if it is, we change this to also be heroic. Okay, so we've come in, we've got our victory type, we determine is it any of these types. If it is, we set the amount to the appropriate value. If it's not any of these types, the amount remains 0, and 0 will get returned. So let's create our second function that we'll be calling later. And that's a function which will be used to calculate if the player has gained enough resource to move to the next tier. So this function is called calculate what should we call it? Calculate progress bar, because that's what we're playing with here. Calculate progress bar tier. Should we pass through the... No, actually we'll use the module level one. So this one is going to be very similar to the one above. It's going to be an if-else block along with a variable, a local variable. This time though, oops, this time the local variable is going to be the tier. So we set that off as 0 and we return tier. Okay. So we're going to now look at the if block. So it's, in this case, if, and we're checking our module level tutorial resource amount. So the variable that we defined before. So we're checking this. If this is less than, now we're going to use another one of our constants, the tutorial tier 1 target, then end. So if the tutorial resource amount is less than the tier 1 target, we haven't reached tier 1 yet, which means we're still on tier 0. We then copy that line, and we're then going into else, and then just paste. And then it's the same. Is tutorial resource amount, is it less than the tier 2 target? And if it's less than the tier 2 target, we must now be on tier 1. Because if we were on tier 0, then the first check would have caught it. So now we can just take that line and copy them and move down a few, and then just paste that back in. And then each time we just increase the tier by 1, so tier target 3, and we increase this by 1 as well. But this tier will always be lagging behind our checked tier by 1. So we just continue on until we've done all of our target checks. So we want to do the check for target 4, which would result in 3. We then want to do the check for target 5. And then we do the check for target 6. You can see why the copy and paste is very handy here. There is another way of doing this where you can use an array or collection and just loop through that and do the check. But when you've got a relatively small number of values to check, I find it preferable to just have it laid out so that's easy to understand. For several months, if you come back to it and look at it, it's always helpful to just be able to look at it and go, oh yeah, I know exactly what's happening there. Whereas if you're using a collection or array, you may have to think about it for a little while. Hopefully you shouldn't have to think too long, but this will cut down the time that you have to refresh your memory about something. So we've come down to, is it less than target 9? If it is, it must be tier 8. We then check on the end and else. So if it has failed all of these, then we must be on tier 9. We must be over the target or equal to the target. So we become tier 9. And that, I believe, is what we need for that function. So we've got two functions, get resource earned by victory type and calculate progress by tier. The third function we're going to create is for updating the user interface. So function, and then this one will be update, what should we call it? Update tutorial UI. We'll pass in the tier that it's going to be updating to. So what do we need to do in this one? Well, the first thing we want to do is we want to check if our tutorial control exists. So m tutorial UI image, just if that then. And then inside here we want to get the image path. So we've done this before in our add tutorial UI image method. So if we scroll up to there and we just copy the line where we set the image path, and then go down to our new function and paste that line in. Then it's very, very similar. So image path is equal to all the same, except for instead of m progress bar tier, we want to use tier, which is the value that's being passed in as an argument. So once we've done that, and we've determined what our new image will be, then we want to set that to the actual user control. So we go m tutorial UI image, and we want the underlying user control. So we go UIC, and then we call a function on there called set, I believe it's set image path, and you pass in the path, which we just determined above. So once you've done that, we want to then make sure that that image is refreshed. So just to be certain, we call something called mTutorialImage.UIC, and there's a method called layout, and this forces a refresh. So it will force that image to be updated. Okay, so we have our 3 new functions which interact with our new constants. So what was the whole purpose of creating these? Well, it's so that we can keep track of our new resource that we mentioned earlier, our tutorial resource amount. So how are we going to increment this though? How is that going to be kicked off? So we're actually going to be monitoring a new event. So we're going to be watching out for when the battle has been completed, and we then determine, did the player take part in that battle? And if they did, were they the attacking faction or the defending faction? And did they win the battle? So the event listener for that is pretty straightforward. So it's the same as before. We go core. So we're not using the campaign manager now, we're using core, which is part of the Creative Assembly scripting interface. And we're saying add listener. So it's very much similar to the one above it. So we should be doing this inside your init tutorial event listeners function. So we're going core add listener. What's the first parameter we give it? The name of our listener. So we are going to call it tutorial underscore progress bar, and then at the end it's going to be battle completed as one word, like so. So that's the name we're giving to our listener. Now, what's the event being performed by the game engine that we actually want to listen for? Well, we want to be notified when a battle completed event is fired. So we just give the string battle completed. So what's next? Do we have any filtering that we want to do? Well, no. At the moment, we're gonna pick up everything. We can filter there if we want to, but for the moment, we'll just pick up everything. The next thing we want to say is this is our method that we want you to call, which will handle that event. So we will say on tutorial progress bar, and then a new one called battle completed, funnily enough. And then the last thing is we're passing through that flag, which is true. I won't get into why that is. It's just true most of the time. So just a few edge cases where it's not. So on tutorial progress bar, battle completed, and then pass through the flags true. So we're now listening for the battle completed event, and when that occurs, we're going to handle that in our spiffy new event handler, which we will create at the bottom of our event handler section. So function, let's select the name there. So function on tutorial progress bar battle completed. There are no parameters. All right, and end. So what do we want to do in here? Well, the very first thing we want to do is we don't want to be wasting our time monitoring a battle completed where our player is not involved. So we're going to say if locSM, if local faction is player controlled, then we're going to change that. If not local faction is player controlled, then exit. So we shouldn't reach that point with local faction not being player controlled, but this is a safety check, just to make sure that we're not wasting time checking through one of the hundreds of battles that are fought each, well, not hundreds, but one of the dozens of battles that are fought each turn. Alright, so now into the meat and potatoes of the function. The first thing we want to do is get the name of the attacking faction, or rather the primary attacking faction, and the name of the primary defending faction. Now I say primary because you can have multiple attackers and multiple defenders, but in our script we're only going to care about who the main attacker is and who the main defender is. Anybody else that gets caught up in the battle, we're not going to care. So we need two new variables, and we're going to call it main attacker faction name. Now, where do we get this from? So we're going to be using a few methods on the campaign manager to access this information. And there's a system known as the pending battle cache, which holds a whole repository of things that to do with battles, both before a battle and after a battle, that you can use in your scripts. So we're going to be calling on the campaign manager. It has a handy function which will get us the name of the primary attacking faction. So that function is, let's see if I remember, pending battle, and then I think it's cache. Yes, pending battle cache. Sweet, cache. Get attacker faction name. That's right. Get attacker faction name. And then we want to tell it we want the primary one. So we want the first one if there's a collection of them. So like so. So our main attacker faction name is going to be set to whatever the first attacking faction name is according to the campaign manager. So we now want to get the defender, and we can just copy and paste that line and just change one word, change attacker to defender in 2 spots, like so. There we go. We now have the name of the attacking faction and the defending faction. So what do we want to do with these? Well, first of all, before we do anything with those, we want to create another variable. And this is going to be how much resource we have earned from this battle, which defaults to 0. Okay, so right, now we'll start to use the main attacker faction name. So we're going to say if the main attacker faction name is equal to our faction. So we're going to say the tutorial faction that we defined earlier. So if the attacker is Balthazar Gelt, then what are we going to do? We're going to ask for a reference to the real faction object. So local attacker faction is equal to, and we ask the campaign manager for this reference. CM get faction. So we used this earlier in our constructor, and we pass through the name, main attacker faction name. Okay, so now that we have our reference to the attacking faction, we need to check, did they win the battle? So we do that by asking the campaign manager another question. So CM, which is a short reference for the campaign manager, and we go to a method on there called pending underscore battle underscore cache underscore, I believe it's attacker victory. Like so. And I think that's right, but yeah, okay. So pending battle cache attacker victory. So that will return a flag, true or false. So if the attacker won the battle, what do we do? Well, we need to find out what sort of victory did they achieve. Did they get a Pyrrhic victory? Did they get a heroic victory? We want to know. So we're going to ask for something else from the campaign manager. So we're going to say local victory type is equal to, and then we're asking the campaign manager again, campaign manager, can I please have so we say the campaign manager, I want to access an object on you called the model, and then we're asking for another reference which is on model. So we're drilling down through campaign manager into model, and now we're drilling into something called pending battle. So this is another object reference, and we want to then drill down into a function on him, and that function is the attacker battle result. So that's going to return a string telling us what sort of victory was achieved. So we're asking our campaign manager, can I please speak to your model reference? And then we say to the model reference, can I please speak to your pending battle reference? And then we say to the pending battle reference, can I please call your attacker battle result function? And then that will return us the string which we assign to our local victory type. Now what do we do with our string? Well, we're going to use it to determine how much resource we've earned. So we're going to take our local variable resource earned, and we're going to set that value to a value returned by one of the functions we created earlier. So if you remember, we created a function called get resource earned by victory type. So we're going to call that, and we're going to give it the victory type we just got from the campaign manager. And then that's going to give us in return the amount of resource that was earned for that victory type. And then that is all we need to do for the attacker. So this block here, we're coming in, is the attacking faction Balthasar Gelt's faction? If yes, we come in, can I please have a reference to the real attacking faction object? Once I've got that reference, we say, did the attacker achieve a victory? If they did, we say, what type of victory did they get? And then we pass that through to our own function, and that will tell us how much resource we're going to assign for that victory. So we've done that for the attacker. We now need to copy that and do the same thing for the defender. So it's pretty much the same block of code, but we're just changing attacker to defender. So we look for any time we've got attacker. So we've got, instead of attacker faction, this becomes defender faction. Then get faction becomes main defender faction name. Then instead of pending battle cache attacker victory, it becomes pending battle cache defender victory. Then the victory type becomes pending battle defender battle result. And then that last line remains the same. Okay. So now, whether the attacking faction was Balthasar Gelt or the defending faction was Balthasar Gelt, we've gone in and we've determined the victory type, and as a result from that we've determined the amount of resource that's been earned. So we now put that resource to use, but only if something was actually earned. So if the resource earned is greater than 0. So if the battle did not involve Balthasar Gelt at all, the resource earned will be 0. So if it's greater than 0 though, what do we want to do? Well, we want to update our cumulative resource amount, so the tutorial resource amount that we defined earlier. We want to take that, we want to say that that is equal to itself plus the resource we just earned. So the first part of this that will be executed is the code that's on the right hand side. So we'll take the existing tutorial resource amount and we'll add that to the resource we just earned. It will then keep that value and set our tutorial resource amount to that value. So it doesn't matter that our tutorial resource amount is on both sides of the equation there, because this will be executed first to calculate the new true value and then it'll assign to it. So with that, what do we want to do? Well, we've now got that. We want to determine, for the amount of resource that we've now reached, what tier are we in? Have we accumulated enough resource to get to another tier? So we're going to have a new variable, local tier, is equal to, and this is where we're going to call another one of those functions we created earlier. And this one is going to be calculate progress bar tier. Okay, and we are passing in nothing, if I remember correctly. So that's going to go away, and it's going to look at all the different tier targets. It's going to look at the total amount of resource we've accrued so far, and then it's going to give us the correct tier that matches up with that amount. So what do we do with this tier? Well, we then want to check, is this tier greater than the current tier? Because if it hasn't changed, there's no point updating the user interface. So if tier is greater than, and we've got a m underscore progress bar tier. Okay, so if it's greater, then we want to call the third function that we created earlier, which is update tutorial UI, and we pass through the tier. And then the last thing we need to do, and this is very important, we need to update the m progress bar tier to the new tier, because that's the one we've been told is the correct one. So we've got our update now of the UI, and we've got our update of the cumulative flag. So is there anything else left to do in this function? Yes, one last thing. Now I've noticed that sometimes when you leave the campaign manager and the campaign screen and go into a battle, when you come back out of that battle, sometimes if you have custom user interface controls on the campaign screen, they don't appear in the position you expect them to. So sometimes they will have moved. So they might have moved a few pixels, or they might have been flown across to the middle of the screen. So to combat that, we need to remind our user control where it should be sitting on the campaign manager screen. So to do that, we want to check if our tutorial image exists, like so. And if it does exist, we then want to set its position. So we should have code for that already. So our on tutorial progress bar turn start, we have the line to do that. So we'll just go and copy that, and then we'll come back down and we'll paste that, and it's the same. So m tutorial UI image, then the underlying user control, move to, and then we've got our two constants defined to tell it where it should be sitting. And once we've done that, that's our functions completed. So let's just reiterate what we did. So we've created two new variables, one to hold the current progress bar resource amount, So that was one of our new variables, the resource amount, and the other variable was, is this player controlled? We've created a new constant to define what faction this will run under, and only that faction. We have a new block of constants for handling what type of victory was achieved and how much resource should be earned, along with how much resource is needed to reach the different targets of our user interface. We have updated our constructor so that we now check if the faction that the player is using is the faction we've defined this for, which is Balthasar Gelt. And then we do another check to see is it actually the player and not the AI that's playing as Balthasar Gelt. Because if it's the AI, we do not care about triggering events or showing the UI interface. So we then use our new check in the rest of the constructor. We've then also created a new listener for listening for the battle completed event. And in that handler for that listener, we check to see what the attacking and defending faction are. We check to see, is the attacker Balthasar Gelt? If it is, did he achieve a victory? And if he did, what type of victory was it? And depending on the type of victory, we set the resource earned. We do the same if Balthasar Gelt's the defender. And then if the resource earned is greater than 0, we then update our user interface after calculating a new tier. And that is pretty much everything we've added today, apart from those 3 new functions, which give us the resource earned and the new tier calculated from the resource amount, and also update the user interface with the new tier image. So with all of those things done, what do we do now? Well, let's save off our file and select everything. So Control A and then Control C to copy it. And we want to go to our pack file manager. So rusted pack file manager. So if you open that and open up your tutorial file that from the last episode. So I have mine open already. So once you've opened your tutorial file, you want to go down to mod and then select the script. And then you want to go Control A and delete everything that's in there. And then Control V to paste in the new stuff that we've just scripted. So we should now have our script updated there. So then save your pack file. And then make sure it's saved to the Steam Games, Steam Apps, Common, Total Warhammer 2 data folder. So I'll just do that now. Okay, and then at this point you run the game. And if everything has gone to plan, then we should find that when we start the game and a new campaign as Balthazar Gelt, we should have our user control in the top left-hand corner. And when we fight a battle, we should gain enough resource that the user control image will change to represent tier 1, and if we were to fight a second battle, it would change to tier 2, and so on and so forth. So let's boot up Warhammer 2 and see how our code has gone. So where is it? Here it is. Let's say play. Okay, so you'll need to go into the mod manager and make sure that the campaign tutorial, make sure the progress bar tutorial has been selected and enabled. So this might just take a little moment. I've got 120 something mods in my mod list, so it takes a little while to load these days. Okay, so scroll down to the bottom. Okay, good. I have the custom progress bar tutorial enabled, so I can play the game. Okay, so now we're in the game. We want to go to campaign, new campaign, and then Mortal Empires, because we want to play as Balthazar Gelt. And then we'll scroll across to the Empire. Where are they? There they are. So let's just select Balthazar, the Golden Boy, and start a campaign.
Hail to you, Lord Balthazar. The your burgeon.
Okay, here we are in the campaign screen. And we can see in the top left hand corner we have our user control. So all we want to do now is check whether or not the new code that we added will increment the progress bar tier as we gain resource from winning battles. So let's select Gelt. Okay, my computer's always a little slow the first time I load up Warhammer. Alright, so we've got Gelt, we've got an enemy here, so let's go and fight them. Sometime today. There we go. Okay, so we should be able to auto-resolve that. And we've got a close victory, so in our table I think a close victory was 25 points.
Very well.
So that's enough, as you see. So it updated the tier. So we achieved a victory and we moved to tier 1. Now you may have noticed it jumped a little bit from its position from where it initially set to here. So that means that our code for setting the initial position isn't doing its job properly. So we'll examine that another time, as that's not the focus of this episode. So let's just see if we can gain enough resource to move us into tier 2. So the enemy army is still there. Let's see if we can finish them off. And if we watch our progress bar, it moved again. Yeah, as I said, we'll figure that out another time. But you can see that the progress bar is updated to tier 2. So the code that we added today with the managing of a new resource and interacting with battles and updating our user interface seems to be working as planned. So we've almost reached we've gone past the 50-minute mark. So I will leave it there for today. I'd like to thank you very much for joining me, and I hope that this episode of the tutorial series has been helpful. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to leave them in the comments section below. Now, as always, I would like to end the video by giving a shout out to my patrons, with a special thanks to Hot Apple Pie and to Cody Bonds. Thank you to all for your continued support. So my name is Grey Tiger. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial episode and series so far, and I'll hopefully see you next time.